Hello, I'm so sorry for the technical difficulty. I can't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, so much better. Amazing. I'm so sorry about that. That was such a weird...
You know, that was my fault because I was looking for an email with your name on it or ethnoculture. And I totally forgot that I had already received the Zoom, but I forgot who sent it to me and what it was called. So,
right.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's all good. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming for our In Conversation with Mona Eltahawy on destroying the patriarchy in a white supremacist world. Before we do get started, I do want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm moderating this panel on today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I would also really like to take a moment to ask our attendees, wherever you may be in the world or in Australia, to take a moment to really acknowledge that you are on stolen land and sovereignty in Australia was never ceded. And also, since we're gathering here today to talk about white supremacy, to talk about patriarchy, I think it's also only fair that I acknowledge the Black, First Nations and Indigenous activists who have paved the way for the work that we do as the Ethnocultural Department and also as a campaign. My name is Niroshini and I will be moderating the panel today. But before I go on to introducing our very, very special guest, I want to talk a little bit about what the campaign is about and how this panel will be working. So Are You Racist ANU is a campaign that is being run by the ANU Ethnocultural Department, and it is all about dismantling white supremacy at the Australian National University and empowering BIPOC within our communities to speak their truth, to tell their story. And this panel is the second panel of a panel series for the campaign itself. And we're very, very lucky to have Mona joining us today. Moving on to how the panel will be working, I will be asking Mona some questions to begin with, but if you have any questions yourself, please hop on to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom, at the bottom of your page, and send in your questions, and Mona and I can get around to asking/answering it. And as for housekeeping rules, please make sure that you are muted at all times. Now, moving on to our very special guest, who I have been raving about this whole week. I can spend an entire hour talking about her, but I think very simply put, Mona Eltahawy is a voice for change we all desperately need to listen to. And when you do listen to her, she will awaken parts of your soul that you didn't even know existed. Mona is an American Egyptian journalist and feminist, and she is the author of The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, and also Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. Interestingly enough, she's also the person who spearheaded the hashtag #MosqueMeToo movement, which is such a massive movement about shedding light on sexual assault and harassment in the Middle East. So now that I've said that, thank you so much for joining us today, Mona. We're so very excited to speak to you. And I want to hop into our first question. When did you become a feminist? When was that point in your life when you realized that this was the way you wanted to live your life?
Right, well, first of all, Niroshni, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all. Hello, everyone. My name is Mona Eltahawy. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I begin everything with my declaration of faith, which is fuck the patriarchy. Having established that, I am delighted to be with you all, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions, and I'm especially honored to be a part of your campaign, Are You Racist ANU, and to challenge white supremacy and to challenge all the various oppressions that we're going to be talking about at every turn. So I'm honored and thrilled to be with you all today. So how or when did I become a feminist? So when I look back, you know, when you look back, it's much more obvious when you look back than as it was happening. But I knew when I look back at my family moving from Cairo, where I'm from, to London, it was very obvious very early on that my mother, as a woman of color, as a Muslim woman, there were so few expectations around her. Because, and I say this because, you know, 7-year-old me, 10-year-old me, you know, little me in the UK was always asked, what does your father do? And the assumption was always, you know, what does your father do that brought you all the way from Egypt to the UK? And, you know, all of us are just kind of following him like sheep. No one stopped. None of my female teachers, mostly white women, stopped to bother to ask, what do your parents do? Or what does your dad and mom do? Because they just assumed my mom, being an Egyptian woman, being a Muslim woman, was just there following her husband. And I would very proudly tell them that my parents were both doing their PhDs in medicine, and that we were in London for both of my parents. So when I look back at that now, so my parents both had scholarships to study in the UK. And I realized that my white female teachers were already practicing a racism of low expectations, in that they had no expectations. It's not even low expectations, zero expectations for my mother. So I'm like kind of like retrospectively angry for her looking back. And then when my family moved to Saudi Arabia when I was 15, and I became a feminist without even knowing the word, just because of the reverse kind of the reverse cultural shock that I experienced, the understanding that there were many different forms of Islam, the understanding that even in this country that was not a white majority country, there was horrendous racism against migrant workers, whether they were domestic workers or drivers or janitors in hospitals, and that there was definitely a hierarchy of race that determined how much money you made, let alone what kind of jobs that were available to you. But then the word itself, feminism, entered the lexicon of my mind and heart at the university library of the university that I went to in Saudi Arabia, where some, I don't know who it was, but seriously bless them, some renegade professor or renegade librarian had created the shelf for feminist literature. It was basically feminist journals and feminism by women of my faith and cultural background. So I discovered Egyptian feminists and Moroccan feminists, and I found the word that explained what I was experiencing. And what I was experiencing was, fuck this shit. This has to end. What the hell is going on in this place? And just my existence here is like the walking embodiment of sin. So these feminists saved my mind, and I was introduced to the word of something that I was already experiencing. So officially at 19, but unofficially much earlier.
Definitely. You draw some very interesting kind of links there between socioeconomic class, racism, patriarchy, misogyny, and you yourself have this very interesting conceptualization of patriarchy itself. And let's talk about that. How do you define patriarchy, and how do you think it manifests itself in this world?
Right. Well, like the textbook definition of patriarchy, and this is something that usually goes way over people's heads, which is why I came up with my own kind of metaphor for it. The textbook definition of patriarchy is a system of oppressions that privileges male dominance. As soon as you start saying a system of, people have already left you. They're not even listening to you anymore. So the way that I explain patriarchy now is I want people to imagine an octopus. And the head of the octopus is patriarchy. And each one of the tentacles, the 8 tentacles of the octopus, is one of those forms of oppression that the head, patriarchy, uses to maintain its primacy or supremacy. So, and it often depends on where in the world you live, but by and large, they're mostly the same. So first of all, we have to recognize that this octopus with the head patriarchy exists everywhere, because patriarchy, whether you're in Australia or China or Zimbabwe or the US or Argentina, regardless of the political climate you live in, whether you're a theocracy, whether you're an atheist country, a monarchy, a constitutional 2-party system, whatever it is, that octopus is there. And the tentacles can be white supremacy, capitalism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, ageism. So all the isms are what are the oppressions that the textbook definition says are the system of oppressions. So I want you to imagine this octopus, and it basically squeezes you in between those tentacles, each one of which is an oppression. And that's why we say you can't just fight misogyny. And that's where I part ways with what we now call white feminism or neoliberal feminism or white women's feminism or liberal feminism, because that usually focuses just on misogyny. But I'm looking at this creature now, the octopus, and I'm not just fighting misogyny. I'm also fighting capitalism, and I'm fighting ableism, and I'm fighting homophobia. So, and that's also part of what the law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who teaches at UCLA in the United States, calls intersectionality. Because she always reminds us that it's about race, class, and gender. And so to understand the importance of fighting all of those oppressions, I want you to imagine a person who is most affected by all of those tentacles. And until that person who is most affected by all those tentacles is free, none of us is free. So you might be an able-bodied person, you might be an able-bodied working class, perhaps heterosexual, cisgendered person, and just one or two of those tentacles affects you. But then you have to think of our disabled friends and comrades. You have to think of our trans friends and comrades. You have to think of our working class and all of those other friends and comrades, Black people, indigenous people, all of them. Because when the more you are squeezed by those tentacles, the more of the oppressions you fight. And unless we liberate everyone from those tentacles, none of us is free.
As people who, as we run this campaign, a lot of us are minorities. Some of us are people of color. Some of us, like you said, are affected by more of those tentacles, all of those tentacles, maybe none of those tentacles. Which part of the octopus do you cut off first if you want to dismantle this oppressive system? Do you cut off the tentacles, or do you cut off the head, or do you cut off, a bit of both?
Well, I would go and fight all of it, as many of it as I can, because each one of those tentacles keeps the head alive. So the more we fight each of the tentacles, the more we weaken the head. But my ultimate fight, I mean, when you ask me as a feminist, what are you? What do you do as a feminist? My response is, my aim in life is the destruction of patriarchy. So I obviously want to destroy the entirety of that octopus. So I find ways of fighting all of those tentacles, knowing that weakening and eventually, because we must cut off those tentacles, cutting those tentacles off will weaken. It will basically stop the blood supply, stop the oxygen, stop whatever the fuck octopi need to stay alive. And you have to imagine, so the octopus is a wonderful, beautiful creature. I'm sorry, octopus, for dragging you into this, but you're so wonderful and apt for my metaphor. But I want you to remember that each one of those tentacles in an octopus, for real now, has a brain. The octopus is a very, very intelligent creature, which is why it's so good and suitable for my analogy. And it manages to squeeze. I mean, if you go on Google and YouTube and just type in octopus, you'll see all these horrific videos of an octopus squeezing itself through the narrowest of cracks. And if you watch that and you hear my voice talking about the patriarchy, you will understand why I want to destroy that fucking patriarchy. Because it's insidious, it's evil, and it knows how to get in all of the cracks. So I want to destroy all of it in its entirety. But my ultimate goal is to destroy patriarchy. And the reason I go on and on about patriarchy is when you talk to people about patriarchy, not only do they not understand what it's about, but they're obviously most of the time unaware of just how prevalent it is. And I often compare it to asking a fish, what is water? When you ask a fish, what is water? The fish is going to look at you as if you're speaking in an alien language. It's going to say, what the fuck are you talking about? What is this thing, water, that you're asking me about? Because water is the thing that surrounds it all the time. That is patriarchy for us as human beings. So, and that's why I keep saying, destroy the patriarchy, because I want to shake people into awareness that it is the very air that we breathe. And we have to cut all the tentacles off to destroy the head, but do not forget that that head is the ultimate goal, because it's that head that maintains that dominance of men, that male dominance, and of, all the classes that we want to destroy.
We, as people of color, often we experience racism, and we also experience misogyny as women, most specifically. How do you think those two kind of systems of oppression very specifically interrelate? Is there a reason why we think patriarchy causes white supremacy, or does white supremacy cause patriarchy, or how does it work?
Well, I think that all of them fall under the head of patriarchy. So for me, white supremacy is one of the tentacles of patriarchy, and another of the tentacles is misogyny. Because misogyny is like, so if patriarchy is that head of the octopus that basically works all the tentacles, misogyny is the ideology that it uses, and sexism is basically that ideology in practice, because misogyny is the hatred of women and sexism is the discrimination against women. And they all fall under that head of patriarchy. So there's a tentacle for misogyny that goes out there and does its evil business, and that holds specifically women back. And obviously as women of color, we're also held back by white supremacy. As working class women, would also be held back by capitalism and all of that. But then when I look at women of color specifically, I often tell people that when, let's take my example. I am a woman of color who was born in Egypt, and I am of Muslim descent. And I often say, one of my biggest fights is to recognize that I basically stand in the middle, in between. And this is something that the majority of women of color experience, Black women, Indigenous women, women of color generally. We are caught between a rock and a hard place. And the rock is white supremacy and the racists, and in the case of women of Muslim descent, Islamophobes as well. And what that rock does is that it uses what happens to us, the misogyny that happens to us from our various communities, and it demonizes the men of those communities by way of feeding its white supremacy, by way of feeding its Islamophobia. And then it points, for example, in my case, to the Muslim community and says, you see, this is what we always tell you about Muslim men. And see, Mona tells you that. But Mona says, shut the fuck up. I'm not your ally. You're not my ally. I will never ally with you, because they are just as misogynist, because white supremacy falls under that octopus, and patriarchy uses white supremacy. And they are just as misogynist. They don't give a flying fuck about me. All they want to do is, they just want to use me to demonize Muslim men. And I say, fuck you. But then the hard place, because I'm caught between a rock and a hard place, the hard place is then my community. You know, people of the Muslim community who want me to shut up because they don't want to make the community, quote unquote, look bad. And this happens to Black women, this happens to brown women, this happens to Indigenous women, this happens to women of color generally. And our communities, plural now, also don't give a fuck about us. All they care about is maintaining a united front, not hanging our dirty linen out in public, not making us look bad. And I always tell them, fuck you, I'm not the one that makes you look bad. You make yourself look bad through your own misogyny. And that rock and that hard place don't give a flying fuck about us. They basically fight over our bodies. They fight over our heads. In the case of Muslim women, literally over our heads, because they're all fighting over headscarves, niqabs, and all of this. And they don't give a fuck about me or anyone else. So this is what I want us to remember as women of color. We carry so much. We end up defending our community against the very things that our community needs to be held accountable for, because we recognize we're fighting the rock. And then we also, while we're exhausted fighting the rock, have to fight our community, because we will not let them silence us in exposing their misogyny. So I stand here, as many women of color do, and I say, fuck you to the rock and fuck you to the hard place. And you see that happening in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, for example. We are experiencing an incredible revolution led by Black Lives Matter. Now, who began the Black Lives Matter movement? It was begun 4 or 5 years ago by 3 queer Black women. And that's really important. All of those identities are important because they recognize that their Blackness, their being women, and their queerness places them in between so many of those tentacles that I'm talking about. And it is a struggle for them. And so many trans women in the Black Lives Matter movement, so many Black women in the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially Black trans women in the Black Lives Matter movement, to tell their communities, hello, we're not here just to fight for Black cishet men. We're not here just to fight for the men. We are also here to fight for Black women. We're also here to fight for Black queer people. We're also here to fight for trans Black people. So this is by way of complicating and reminding everyone here that it is fucking exhausting to fight that octopus. It is, and I recognize that. But it's also a reminder to not ignore one tentacle for the sake of the other. Because if we ignore the rock for the sake of the hard place, we're screwed. And if we ignore the hard place for the sake of the rock, we're screwed. So gain your energy, recognize that it needs stamina. This is a marathon and all those other cliches that we talk about. It's not a sprint, but always keep that octopus in view and always aim for all of the tentacles so that you can destroy the head.
Sorry, I just muted myself. One of the things that you talk about as I make my way through reading your book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, is anger. And anger is something we've all been feeling while we run this campaign, and we discover and we become more, we are confronted with white supremacy on a daily basis through this campaign. But anger is also all-consuming, and it is very detrimental in certain cases. How can we weaponize that anger in a way that isn't all-consuming, but also use it to enact change?
No, anger is really important. It's not the beginning and the end, it's just the beginning. Because one of the things that you're seeing happening over and over, I don't know if it began in Australia as much as it has in the US, but in the US, we began to see this rash of books about anger by white women. And it was especially after that fascist fuck Donald Trump was elected president, and all of a sudden, white women discovered their anger. And you know, so many of us women of color sitting there going, are you fucking kidding me? You're just angry now. You weren't angry like, you know, 700 years ago. You weren't angry when Donald Trump began his campaign to be president by calling Mexicans rapists and murderers. You weren't angry when he was saying, I'm going to ban Muslims. You weren't angry when he was being an ableist fuck by mocking a disabled journalist. They just began to get angry when that tape was leaked with Donald Trump saying, when you're a celebrity, women let you grab them by the pussy. So they just got angry when it was about misogyny. And this is why I keep talking about the octopus. And so, and as I say in my book, in the chapter on anger, when white women discovered their anger, they thought that they were launching a revolution. And so many of us women of color sitting there going, yeah, stand in line, you know, join our revolution of anger, which has been going on for fucking forever, you know? So, okay, good. They finally discovered their anger. Hello, finally. But anger is not enough. Anger is the start. And so what I would suggest is read my book, of course, but also read Audre Lorde, because I quote Audre Lorde about anger and the importance of anger. Audre Lorde wrote a really important essay called The Uses of Anger. And it's on the use and the importance of anger. And I quote him in my book as saying that anger is like the fuel for the engine of change. That your anger is that spark, that fuel that begins this engine that is going to basically carry you towards destroying that octopus called patriarchy. So tap into your anger, use your anger, don't swallow your anger, because one of the dangers of always telling, especially girls, because you know everyone is born with anger and rage, but we socialize girls out, we socialize that anger out of girls by insisting that they're polite and quiet and modest and humble. And what then that ends up happening then is anger is an energy, and they end up swallowing that anger and keeping it inside. And what that does is, instead of raging at the injustices of that octopus that has patriarchy as the head and having that righteous rage, they internalize it, and it becomes sadness, and it becomes self-harm, and it becomes eating disorders, and it becomes a self-hatred that stays with us, especially for cis women, for the longest time. And we have to fight really hard to tap into that rage that we were born with, but which was broken out of us. We were broken out. It was socialized out of us. So use that anger and never allow anyone to tell you that your anger is too much. The revolution needs you to be too much. There is no revolution that isn't too much. You know, I get called, one of the things I say in my book, and something that someone once wrote to me and said, I was too scared to read you for a long time, because someone said Mona Eltahawy is, what did they say? Mona Eltahawy is too loud, swears too much, and goes too far. And I'm like, is that supposed to be an insult? Because I'm fucking honored. Thank you. Because that's what the revolution is. The revolution is too loud, goes too far, and swears too much, you know? So hold on to your anger. And as women of color, anger is really tricky as well, because especially for Black women, they're stereotyped as the angry Black woman, as a way of shaming them out of that really necessary energy, you know? So be angry, be profane. This is why I say fuck every 2 minutes. Be profane. There is nothing polite about injustice. There is nothing polite about white supremacy. There is nothing polite about patriarchy. And yet, patriarchy and white supremacy and race have the nerve to insist that we're polite? When I was on your TV show, Q&A, one of the reasons that the episode I was on was banned was because I said fuck 10 times. You're like, are you fucking kidding me? Fuck all of you. Of course I'm going to say fuck 10 times. Next time, if I'm ever back on that fucking show, I will say fuck 20 times. Just because a bunch of white men got upset that Mona said fuck. Oh my God. Like, Australia is such a polite country. They steal land, they kill people, they genocided the First Nations people, and then all of a sudden they care about politeness. And every other word in the Australian lexicon is fuck, but how dare this woman of color of Muslim descent come into our living rooms and say fuck all of you. So be angry, be uncivil, be profane, but use your anger strategically, like Audre Lorde said. You remember, it's a fuel, and it's just the beginning, it's not the end. There are so many, I give you other sins to commit besides anger. There are so many other things that you need in the fight to destroy that octopus, alongside anger.
I think that was a really interesting answer, and I think it's gotten us fired up for the rest of this conversation. One of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years of the feminist movement is the rise of white women feminism. And you talked about this a little bit before. And by white women feminism, I don't mean white women who identify as feminists, but white women who are co-opting the feminist space and think that their struggles are the only struggles that the feminist movement is fighting for. We've also seen a lot of white women come into leadership positions in the last couple of years, which is amazing because, you know, females having power is something that we need to see in the world. But that's also been met with a very interesting kind of statement or culture of, you just need to work hard and you will get there and you'll be fine. And as someone who goes to a university where the chancellor of my university is a white woman who formerly was the foreign minister of the Liberal Party and says those kinds of things, what is your message for women who embody things like that? And how can white women who don't necessarily identify with that ideology better empower themselves to be constructive in their fight towards destroying the patriarchy?
Right. That's a really important question. So thank you for asking me that, because I tackle that in the chapter in the 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, on the chapter about power. Because, you know, around the time, and I know that you had a woman prime minister, and the UK has had 2, other countries around the world have had several. We've seen Indira Gandhi, we've seen Benazir Bhutto, Margaret Thatcher. New Zealand has a female prime minister, and several countries around the world right now. But the United States, being the United States, always thinks it's the center of the fucking universe. And so because a woman has not been president there, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, it was hailed as, okay, this is it. Once this happens, all the problems of women around the world and feminism will have been settled. And that was the furthest thing from the truth. Because we also, by way of complicating it necessarily, I insist that we ask, when we talk about women and we talk about power and we talk about white women, we also ask this woman who is running for a leadership position, and this woman who has power or wants to be in a position of power, what is she using her power for? Is this a woman who's going to uphold the patriarchy, or is this a woman who's going to dismantle the patriarchy? I am interested in the latter, and I'm not interested in the former. So the way that I critiqued Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton's platform was to ask those questions of her, in the same way that, you know, again, to use the United States as an example, is what I did in my chapter and in an essay I wrote for the New York Times when I used to write for that newspaper, to ask about how when Donald Trump named a woman to be the head of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, he hailed it as a feminist victory. And I was like, fuck that shit. That is no feminist victory for me. My feminism is not fighting for the right to torture men, to torture in the same way that men can torture. So you might have a woman as the head of the CIA, but that is not a feminist victory. Because is she upholding or dismantling patriarchy? She's clearly upholding patriarchy, because the CIA and what the CIA does for the state with a big S, is to uphold the patriarchal power of the state. Militarism is part of that. Capitalism is part of that. The torture that the CIA uses as part of its modus operandi, all of that. So that is not a feminist victory. And for me, Hillary Clinton has achieved a lot for women in power through her being Secretary of State, the most powerful woman in the world when she was, blah, blah, blah. But what did she want as a Secretary of State, and what did she represent, and what did she represent as a female candidate for president? And for me, that was not what I wanted in a feminist leader, because what I want in a feminist leader is to dismantle the patriarchy, not uphold it. And when you apply that litmus test to so many other women in leadership positions, especially those who are lean right, who are center right, or just plain far right wing, like several of the women who are in charge of European countries right now, they most definitely uphold the patriarchy because just by virtue of their right wing ideology. But again, they're held up to us as some kind of feminist victories. And then to further explain that and to introduce now white women and their co-opting of feminism that you were asking me about, I want us to imagine that the power that patriarchy allows women to have, and this is why I always ask, are you dismantling or upholding? Patriarchy throws women crumbs, and it makes women compete over those crumbs, and it makes women always remember that those crumbs that were given to you can be taken away from you. And so I say, I refuse the crumbs that patriarchy throws me. I want the whole cake. And not only do I want the whole cake, I don't want patriarchy's cake. As an anarchist feminist, I want my own cake. I do not want the cake given to me by the state, because then it comes with all the other things that the state insists that I pledge allegiance to, which I refuse. So once you start seeing that, then you start to see why white women vote for right-wing parties, because they've accepted the crumbs from those right-wing parties. And those right-wing parties then, for example, there are right-wing parties in Europe, like Poland, like France, like Greece, like Germany, that promise white women better welfare and benefits when they have more children. Now, on the face of it, that sounds like a great thing. But what they're actually doing is they are pitting white women against migrants and immigrants. Because while they're doing this and promising benefits for having more white children, they are, as part of this octopus with the tentacles that I talk about, they are demonizing men of color. They are portraying migrants who go to Europe as men who want to come and rape white women. They are demonizing black men and brown men and other men of color as criminals who just want to steal white women away. And at the same time, they are demonizing migrant and immigrant communities as having too many babies. So when you look at that and you see why those white women are voting for those right-wing parties, and you understand that it's about having more white babies, and then you unpack it further and you see that in many cases these are working class white women, then you understand more and more why the tentacles of the patriarchy are important to pay attention to, because they are using the working class status of those women, and they are using the whiteness of those women to get the allegiance of those women to white men. Because by their proximity to white men, they get the crumbs of white power, but then they don't see how that white power harms them by considering them walking incubators, insisting that they have babies, etc. Now, this has been a long, rambling answer, but it does have a thread that links it all. And that thread is patriarchy. And that thread insists that we ask, does your feminism uphold patriarchy or dismantle patriarchy? If it's a feminism that says lean in and insist that you get a corner office and insist that you become CEO, well, I don't want to be a CEO. My feminism does not have it as goal and ambition to be a millionaire. I don't want to be rich. I don't want to be a CEO. I don't want to have a corner office. Instead, I want to ask, what ambition is a working class woman allowed to have? What ambition is a migrant domestic worker who goes from the Philippines to Lebanon, or from the Philippines to a family in Australia or in the UK or somewhere in Europe, to make 10 times what she makes in the Philippines, to leave her family behind to go and look after someone else's family? What ambition is she allowed to have? Because I'm not interested in the CEOs, I'm not interested in the millionaires, I'm interested in the women who are being strangled by all of those tentacles of the patriarchy. That's the feminism that I'm interested in. Not Hillary Clinton, not Margaret Thatcher, not Indira Gandhi or Benazir Bhutto. I'm interested in the women who will help me destroy that octopus.
We just had a really interesting question come in from someone, and they are basically, so this question is from Sophie, and they are saying that from engaging with queer Indigenous social movements, it seems to me that patriarchy, with its toxic gender roles and heteronormativity, is a product of white supremacy, because looking at pre-colonial Indigenous cultures, gender and sexuality operated much more diversely, and patriarchy was in fact not the norm for every Indigenous culture. So does white supremacy come before patriarchy in cases like that? And Sophie here is challenging that octopus analogy that you gave us, what patriarchy is the head. Is it possible for, in contexts such as queer Indigenous activism, that white supremacy is in fact the head and not patriarchy?
The reason that I put patriarchy as the top of the head, and I hear everything that you just said, and thank you for that feedback, Sophie, and for the question. The reason that I put patriarchy at the top of the head is that because everywhere across the world, and in pre-colonial times as well, this existed. Patriarchy existed. There were systems that in many parts of the world, now there might have been exceptions, but in most parts of the world, male dominance was the reality. What happened with colonialism and what happened with imperialism is that they came, and through the theft of the land, through the genocide of the people, through the introduction of white Christian Victorian values, they included another element or further tentacles to the patriarchy. But if you look at, say, pre-colonial countries on the continent of Africa, where I come from, again, patriarchy was in place. I come from Egypt, and when I look at ancient Egypt, we did have a queen called Hatshepsut, right? But there was patriarchy that she had to work within. There was patriarchy that insisted that it was a man who was the pharaoh, and it was a man who was embedded with the aspects of a god, so that he was a god and a pharaoh at the same time. And this was before Egypt was colonized by anyone. So in many instances, now there might be exceptions that I'm unaware of. And if this was the case in pre-colonial, pre-imperial Australia, then I would love to learn more about that. But patriarchy isn't just about sexuality and queerness. For me, patriarchy encompasses, like I said, all of those tentacles. It encompasses not just white supremacy, it encompasses other forms of supremacy. So when I talk now also as someone of Muslim descent, it will in some instances encompass the supremacy of Islam, because there are countries where Islam went and established an empire. Do you know what I mean? And then the people who are not Muslim then had to basically become subjects of that empire called Islam. We don't talk about that a lot, but that is also part of the patriarchy that existed at the time. Now, there might have been a better understanding of gender fluidity. There might have been a better understanding of sexual fluidity before the Christian white Victorians came along. And that is great. But there were other elements of capitalism that existed. There were other elements of the other forms of oppression that I'm talking about. And also, so having said that, I would love to learn about pre-colonial times that didn't have patriarchy. There were some areas around the world that were matriarchal, but sadly they've been wiped out. And anyway, I don't want a matriarchy. I want hierarchies to be abolished. So I don't want to replace the patriarchy with the matriarchy. I want to destroy the octopus in all its manifestations, because I don't believe in hierarchies. As an anarchist, I want to destroy hierarchies. I don't want to come under the power of anyone, and I don't want to subject anyone to my power. I want freedom from all oppressions and oppressive forms of power. Having said all of that, matriarchies, pre-colonial eras that existed where patriarchy wasn't so pronounced, I also want to talk about today, because I also want to resist the temptation to say that it was so great before then, and then white people came and destroyed everything. And white people did destroy a lot, but I want us to live in today. And I want us to live with the oppressions of today. Yes, I want us to be proud. I'm proud of my ancient Egyptian heritage for many reasons, but I recognize that it had patriarchy. But I also, so while we can acknowledge and be proud of our heritage, and while we can denounce and say, fuck the genocide and the savagery of colonizers, we should also, I urge us to also live in the today. Be proud of that, condemn and say, fuck the savagery of the colonizers who destroyed so much of that, but also live in the today and see how these things play out today. Because when we focus on the today, and use the pride that we had in our culture, in our heritage, when we focus on it today, we put the energy in what is happening now, rather than in fighting to try to get back to something that we don't know how they existed. You know, I don't want to go back to ancient Egyptian times, because I don't want to be subject to the pharaoh who was always a man. I want freedom today. So again, you know, this is a complicated and rambling answer. I recognize the need to be proud, of our heritage, I recognize that indigenous cultures in so many parts of the world had things that were destroyed that we must acknowledge and celebrate. And they were destroyed by the savagery of colonizers. But I also want us to focus in the today and how we destroy patriarchy today.
Speaking of in the today, one of the stakeholders that we often don't talk about in feminism is the men. And as someone who was raised by a single father, I think the way my dad has raised me has influenced my feminism, but it's also made me understand that men can often feel alienated as a result of the patriarchy. Toxic masculinity is a result of the patriarchy. How do we bring them into, you know, the equation of destroying the patriarchy without alienating them? Because at the end of the day, they are also beneficiaries of this product, right? So how does that work?
You know, usually when I'm asked about what about the men, what can we do about the men, I usually say, fuck the men. I don't give a flying fuck about the men. Everything's always about the men. Can we just talk about feminism without having the men, without centering the men? But I love the example that you gave of your dad, because what it reminds us of, it reminds us that feminism is good for everyone. Bell Hooks, another one of my heroes, has written a very short, very simple book that is called Feminism is for Everybody. And she mentions this, and Bell Hooks has written a lot about how great feminism is for men because it liberates them from what I call now the octopus. Because men, in this, you know, in the same way that we tell white supremacists and racists, unless you're actively fighting white supremacy and racism, you are factually benefiting from white supremacy and racism. I say the same to men, especially cisgender heterosexual men. I say to them, unless you're actively fighting the patriarchy, you are factually benefiting from the patriarchy. But then I also remind them, and this is why they need feminism, toxic masculinity is one of those tentacles. And when they look at that octopus, they will recognize very quickly that they are subject to the tentacle of white supremacy if they're not a white man. They are subject to the tentacle of capitalism if they're not, you know, one of the 1% and the billionaires. They are subject to the tentacle of ableism if they are disabled in any way. If they are queer, they are subject to the tentacle of homophobia and transphobia. If they are too old or too young, quote unquote, for various things, they are subject to the tentacle of ageism. And at the end of the day, do they not want to be free of things that say a man must protect and provide? Do they not want to also be protected and provided for? Do they not want to be free to express their emotion? Do they not want to be free to express their sexuality in the way that they want? To be bisexual, to be queer, to be asexual, to be anything other than their cisgender penis? Do they not want the freedom to do that? So this is why feminism is good for everyone. But at the same time, if they don't want to hear that, I'm not going to waste my energy on them because I will destroy the patriarchy with or without them. But what I want them to understand is that while patriarchy harms them, patriarchy kills us as women. Now, it will kill them if they're queer men. It will kill them if they're trans men. It will kill them if they're working class men and they're sent to do all these dangerous jobs in so many cases. So at the end of the day, honestly, who does patriarchy actually benefit? So many men walk around with the illusion that patriarchy benefits them when it doesn't, which is exactly why I say my feminism is destruction of patriarchy, but my feminism is not, my feminism is more than equality. I want something much more than equality with men, because men are subject to all of those tentacles as well. And most often, in most time, they don't see that. So I say, I want something much more than equality. I want to be free, because I don't want to be equal to a man who is subject to racism. I don't want to be equal to a man who's subject to capitalism. I don't want to be equal to a man who's subject to all the other tentacles. I want to be free. That is my feminism. So I always say that freedom is much bigger than equality. And when I say that, I think this is when men begin to understand that they're not free. They're like, hold on, what are you saying here? You don't want to be equal to me, because they think they're so great, you know? They think that it's a gift that they allow us to be equal to them. And then I remind them, excuse me, you're not free. I want something much bigger than equality. I want to be free. And then the light comes on and they're like, where's that fucking octopus? I'm gonna kill it too. Then we can converse.
We just have a question from someone else, and they are saying, as a Black woman who grew up in working class Morocco, my mother believes that religion and feminism are incompatible. What are your thoughts on this perspective?
Okay, when I was younger, I would say, no, religion and feminism are not incompatible. And I would often point as I still do actually, to Islamic feminists like the Black American scholar of Islam, Amina Wadud, like the Moroccan feminist sociologist who was one of my earliest feminist role models, Fatima Mernissi. Fatima Mernissi often wrote about Islam and often wrote in ways that she insisted on rescuing Islam from patriarchy and misogyny. And she, like I said, she was one of my earliest feminist role models. She was one of those feminists of my cultural and faith backgrounds that I found on those university bookshelves in Saudi Arabia. Fatima Mernissi and Mona Eltahaway, who was Egyptian, but Mona Eltahaway doesn't write about Islam in the same way that Fatima Mernissi did. Sadly, Fatima Mernissi has died. But Fatima Mernissi was instrumental in helping me as that young Muslim woman who believed at the time that religion and feminism could coexist. And I went in 2009 to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia to be part of a launch of something called Musawa. Musawa is the Arabic word for equality, and Musawa is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. Now, Musawa is an umbrella organization that has Islamic feminists and secular feminists. And I now, so over the past, I would say 10 to 15 years, I have moved away from Islamic feminism and I am very much in the secular camp. And the reason that I have done this is that I am tired of doing my verse versus your verse, because a lot of the work of Islamic feminism is the reinterpretation of religion. So people like Amina Wadud and others will reinterpret various verses in the Quran, for example, or reinterpret jurisprudence and others and say, we're giving it a feminist reinterpretation because Islam was never meant to be misogynist. Islam is feminist. I'm tired of that because there's always some misogynist who will come up and say, no, actually this interpretation is more important. And they end up being in this endless fight that has no end. So I have stepped out of that now. I have now for many years, and I say, if you want to reconcile religion with feminism, I direct you to those Islamic feminists. I don't do that anymore. I am a secular feminist. I am a feminist. And I don't care what anybody's religion says. If it hurts women, girls, and queer people, I will fight it because my feminism is aimed at that octopus. The majority of religions around the world are misogynist. The majority of religions around the world are patriarchal. Now, when I speak on the continent of Africa, where I come from, many of my African feminists and comrades will tell me there are some African religions, spiritual religions, that predate the Abrahamic religions that are not misogynist or patriarchal, much in the same way as I responded to Sophie's question about indigenous cultures that are much more welcoming to sexual and gender fluidity. My response to my fellow African feminist friends and comrades is, I want to learn more about those religions because it's good to know that they exist. But most of the time, I am dealing with Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and other forms of religion, which by and large are patriarchal and misogynist. Some of my Sikh friends tell me the Sikh religion is not patriarchal. I would like to learn more. But my experience with most religions, this is why I qualify it now with most religions, is that they are patriarchal and they are misogynist and they do benefit men more than women. So, however, having said that, I want to remind people that patriarchy that I say exists within those religions exists outside of those religions. So while I tell people, if you want Islamic feminism, it's over there, I'm not giving you the religious feminism. I also, when I'm asked, why don't you just tell these religious women to leave their religion? I say, shut the fuck up, okay? Because it's not that simple. Because first of all, some women don't want to leave their religion. Who am I to tell them to leave their religion? Second of all, some women can't leave their religions because they could be killed. They could die. How fucking privileged of you to just walk up to a woman and say, hello, if you just left your religion, all your problems will be solved. Fuck off. That's so fucking condescending, patronizing, and privileged, you know? And then third of all, if I tell those women, which I don't, if you leave your religion, all your patriarchal problems will be solved, that's delusional because there's patriarchy outside of religion too, because of that octopus. Because if one of those tentacles is religion, there are 7 other tentacles. So a woman will leave her religion and what? She's left the patriarchy of her religion only to go into, so the frying pan of her religion only to go into the fire of patriarchy. So that's not my goal here. My goal is to destroy patriarchy wherever it exists. So to help my sisters who want to remain in their religion and want scholars of their religion who are feminist, I say to them, read Amina Wadud, read Asma Barlas, read Fatima Mernissi. For those who want the secular way, I also offer feminists to follow and lead, including myself. But I no longer say that you can reconcile religion with feminism, because I'm not interested in that fight anymore. My fight is against patriarchy inside religion and outside religion.
We have time left for one more question. So that question is, can women dismantle the patriarchy without the support of the state? And this person talks about the president of Egypt, Al-Sisi's state-sponsored feminism, which was very much giving women crumbs. And on that note, do we need the institutions' support to make changes such as destroying the patriarchy? And should women enter those institutions, run for politics, etc.?
Right. Well, thank you for that question, because it's very relevant to things that are happening in Egypt today, because a feminist revolution has truly begun in Egypt, like fucking finally. And we could have like 2 hours talking about that, but I won't. But I'm beginning to write the follow-up to my first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, because that book insisted on something that is a direct response to that question. In my book, I said, we have had political revolutions my book called it the Middle East. We are increasingly being encouraged to call it West Asia now, because the Middle East is a colonial construct, and in acknowledgement of that, I want to practice and insist to myself that I call it West Asia now. So in West Asia and North Africa, or Southwest Asia and North Africa, we had various uprisings and revolutions that began with Tunisia almost exactly 10 years ago, spread to Egypt, went to Libya, went to Syria, went to Bahrain, went to Yemen. Those revolutions were men and women rising up together against the state, which oppresses everyone. At the time that the Egyptian revolution happened, Sisi was the head of military intelligence. And less than a month after the Egyptian revolution forced the dictator of the time, Hosni Mubarak, to step down, Sisi, as head of military intelligence, approved of so-called virginity tests that female activists were subjected to. These were forms of sexual assault called virginity tests. So this man, who in 2011, as head of military intelligence, subjected female activists to forms of sexual assault, is now portraying himself as the savior of Egyptian women, who insists on pushing our parliament to pass tougher laws against sexual violence. I say fuck off Sisi, just as I say fuck off Donald Trump. Donald Trump has called Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, this fascist fuck president of Egypt, my favorite dictator. So I am not going to ask patriarchy with a big P, which is the state, to save me from patriarchy with a small p, which is the street and the home. Because that was the premise of my first book. In my first book, I said, our political revolutions will fail unless we take that revolution which rose up against the dictator in the presidential palace, and we rise up against the dictator on the street corner and against the dictator in the home. And when I said that, when I wrote my first book, many of my feminist comrades and many of my comrades in Egypt generally, especially the men, would say, but Mona, nobody is free. This isn't the time to talk about feminism. The state, it oppresses us all, torture, oh my God. And I would say to them, okay, comrade so-and-so, yes, it's true. Nobody is free. The state oppresses everyone, but the state oppresses men and women, but together, the state, the street, and the home oppress women. And I call that the trifecta of oppression. So my feminism targets the state, it targets the street, and by the street, I mean public space, work, everything that happens outside of the home and everything that happens outside of state institutions. And by the home, of course, I mean the family, I mean the bedroom, I mean sex, I mean brothers, fathers, husbands, I mean the privacy of the home. And the revolution against the home is the hardest of those revolutions, because all of those dictators, the dictators of the state and the dictators of the street, go home. And that is the hardest revolution. And that is the revolution that is beginning in Egypt, that has begun, because there are more and more women now. Unprecedented numbers of women in Egypt are exposing sexual predators, are saying, I was subjected to sexual violence, and are naming the men who did this. And that is takes tremendous courage anywhere in the world. But in a country where you have been silenced by taboos for so long, it's especially courageous. And at the same time, the Egyptian state that is now pretending to care about women by passing these tougher laws, that same state is the state that subjected women to sexual violence in 2011, and today is arresting and sending to prison TikTok women. They're called TikTok women. These are female influencers on TikTok, many of whom have millions of followers. And at the same time that they're passing tougher sentences on sexual violence, they are sending those women to prison on charges of violating family values as part of a moral crusade. So you can't trust the state to save you from the patriarchy and from predators when the state itself is predatory and when the state itself is patriarchal. So my feminism does not depend on the state. My feminism doesn't work with the state. Now, there are some feminists who have chosen to work inside because they believe in change from within. I don't believe in change from within, and I've never wanted to be inside. But their positions inside are strengthened by our positions outside. So I will look at them as strategic allies who within the system need us on the outside to be as radical as possible, so that we can create a space for them within that very, very limited system they have chosen to work within. I'm not interested in state-sponsored feminism. And I will wrap up this answer by explaining why. Because in Egypt right now, state-sponsored feminism acts in the shape of the National Council for Women. That National Council for Women has used its lawyers to defend the women who have been exposing sexual predators. And that sounds like a good thing, right? But that same National Council for Women, state-sponsored feminism, refuses to support the TikTok women who are being subjected to a moral crusade by the state and who are being accused of being indecent, of being whores, of being sluts, simply for dancing and singing on TikTok. So the National Council for Women are allowing themselves to be used as part of that moral crusade by refusing to help. And who are these TikTok women? They are mostly working class young women. And who are the women who are being helped by the National Council for Women and for whom the state is passing tougher laws? They are women from middle class and upper middle class, wealthy, privileged families. So my feminism will fight for all of them, and it will not abandon the working class women, and it will not allow the predatory state to portray itself as my savior. I say, fuck you to the state and its state-sponsored feminism.
So that brings us to the end of our conversation with Mona. But before we leave, I want to do a very quick recap of what we've talked about. There are 6 take-homes that I've established by talking to you, Mona, that I think the rest of our attendees would also really benefit from. So number 1, the patriarchy is an octopus. We've talked about this, and we've talked about how you need to fight it from all specific points. It's not a fight from one way upwards or from the head down or from one tentacle out. And the octopus itself will never be demolished until the person who is most affected by all of those tentacles is free. Number 2, as women of color, as minorities, you are often caught between a rock and a hard place. Don't ignore both sides, but it's really important that you disidentify in a way that you carve out rather your own space, as Mona talks about it. Number 3, anger is just the beginning of what is going to be such a massive movement of change that Mona has inspired us to, go ahead and read her book even more, because that's just not the only necessary sim there. Number 4, we've talked about women in power. When we talk about women in power and we see them uphold these leadership positions, it's really important for us to ask them, what kind of power do they want to uphold? Does your feminism support the destruction of the patriarchy, or does it support upholding the patriarchy? And in that light, white women need to stop accepting crumbs from the patriarchy, as Mona says. Mona wants freedom as opposed to equality, and she wants that freedom through destroying the patriarchy. Very weighted language here, but I think there's a very important distinction to be drawn in the kind of feminism you advocate for, Mona. And finally, we talked about the trifecta of the state, street, and home. And it's unimportant for us to think about the predatory nature of the state. We need to stop looking to the state to solve our problems, as opposed to taking it within our own hands, and think about how it manifests itself in the most private place of being, which is our home. So that's my little breakdown from what I've learned from you. I've learned so much and I'm so excited to keep learning. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we really enjoyed talking to you. And thank you so much to everyone else who tuned in. We hope to keep this panel series going, so keep an eye out on our Facebook pages for our upcoming panels. And once again, thank you so much for coming, everyone, and fuck the patriarchy.
Fuck the patriarchy. Thank you, everyone. Fuck the patriarchy.
Bye, everyone.